Anticausatives and A-movement in the history of Latin. So the starting point, I would like to revisit in this talk a number of observations I made earlier about the diachrony of Latin. So in a number of corpus studies, I observed that as time goes by, rates of A-movement of subject DPs rise in frequency in the corpus data. I would like to start with the results of another corpus experiment that I did more recently, which basically confirmed this observation in a rather clear way. For reasons of time, I can't say too much about the methodology of the corpus study. So I briefly summarize what I did on this first slide. I looked at the period from 200 BCE till 600 AD. So that's a period of 800 years. It's quite long. There's 40 text samples. What I used as a demarcating category to tell apart VP internal from TP internal subjects is adverbs. Let's, for the sake of simplicity, assume that those are VP adjoined. Now, when you study Latin clause structure, it's always very difficult to control for structural ambiguity. Latin word order is very flexible. What in actual practice this means is that you have to be very careful that you're not looking at stuff that sits in the right or in the left periphery of the clause. And what we're interested in here is DPs that sit in the verb phrase and DPs that sit in the tense phrase, not in the CP, not in the right periphery, whatever that is. This difficulty is exacerbated by the fact that you also have to be careful that it's not just the subject DPs that are in some sense peripheral, but also the demarcating categories you're using, the adverbs. What this entails is that I have to throw away a lot of the material, and what I kept as syntactically unambiguous tokens of VP and TP internal subjects is a set of 415 observations, whereas I started out with over 11,000 tokens. Now, those 415, if you map those over time, what I'm measuring here is the rate of TP internal subjects, and it's pretty clear that there is an upward trend in the data to the effect that TP internal subjects become more frequent. So there's a fair amount of variation in this data set. It's in addition a bit unfortunate that I have that the sample sizes for the authors before Cicero, that's in particular Plautus and Terence, were very small, so I couldn't really use them. But in any event, I'm pretty confident that this is yet another piece of evidence that there is something going on diachronically in terms of subject placement. What kind of questions does this raise? That's the usual suspects. On the one hand, why do we see this diffusion? Why the spread of one pattern to the detriment of another? In addition, there's also the usual question about actuation. Bless you. So can we say something about how A-movement for DPs came into being? And in order to say anything about that second question, I will necessarily have to do some amount of reconstruction, because it's clear that it was there from the earliest records onwards. But I think that given a number of theoretical assumptions, it's indeed possible to say something about that. So more concretely, as to the origins of the change, I will say that the availability or otherwise of A-movement is correlated with the internal structure of the verb phrase, and more specifically with verbal morphology. As to the spread, the diffusion of the change, this I will say I will have to say less about this, but I do think you can make sense about this given a number of assumptions about the expression of, and indeed the unambiguous expression of parameter settings, and then a variationist model of acquisition by that token change. At the theoretical level, and this ties in with what I said earlier about the relation between morphology and parameter setting, I assume that functional heads come in strong and weak versions. That's an old idea. slightly more recently, Chomsky has come back to this idea by saying that weak heads, and in particular English T, are unable to label their mother node, and the context here is the labeling framework that Chomsky has worked out in recent publications. In a slight departure of Chomsky's ideas, I would assume that weakness, morphological weakness, is not in the first place a function of morphological impoverishment, but rather that it is indicative of a morphology syntax mismatch, and I'll come back to that at large. So concretely, just to give you a foretaste, the idea is that there's something going on with Latin voice, and I would like to propose that Latin voice is in many ways the mirror image of English T, in the sense that it expresses some morphosyntactically relevant information, but if you map that onto the syntactic structure that a given word is embedded in, there appears to be a mismatch. So in the case of English T, tense contrasts can be expressed without activating the T node. In the case of Latin, as we will see, there is a violation of the mirror principle. Voice morphology appears in the wrong place, too far away from the verbal root. And then I will more or less faithfully follow Chomsky by interpreting this weakness as the inability to provide a label, and that in turn is associated with what you could call EPP effects, the obligatory presence of a specifier phrase. So after this short introduction, just an overview of the structure of the talk. In the second section, I will briefly recapitulate what I said earlier about Latin clause structure, and I'll point out a number of questions that I think remain open. In the third section, I will talk about weak voice and the implications I think it has for labeling. In the fourth section, I will introduce another concept that I haven't mentioned, but which features in the title of the talk, namely on anticausatives. There is something that changes in the morphological expression thereof, and at first sight, this seems unrelated to what I've been saying up to now. But I will end up suggesting in the final section that this one rather small innovation actually has pretty far-reaching consequences that set in motion a series of events. So, background about Latin clause structure. So what I've been defending in earlier work is that a major change took place in the development from early and classical Latin towards late Latin at the level of EPP checking. The model that I assume is inspired by Alexiadou and Anagnostopoulou, and more specifically by work by Teresa Biebrauer. The idea is always that there is indeed a universal requirement that there is some functional head pretty high up in the middle field, say the TP domain, which needs to be lexicalized explicitly by a 5-feature bearing category. But although it is universal, the languages of the world differ, there is some flexibility as to the ways in which this can be done. Concretely, Biebrauer and Richards propose that there are 2 independent parameters which govern this variability. Namely, first, the nature of the element that is attracted, is a head or a phrase, and second, the option of whether or not it pipes additional material. That gives you 4 different possibilities. And what I suggested earlier, and what I still think is on the right track, is that the earlier grammar of the of Latin chooses the option plus piping and attraction of x0 syntactic head goal, and that this changes to minus piping and but still attraction of a verbal head. Concretely, what does it look like in terms of syntactic structures? The first grammar A option results in VP movement, and so that's the effect of piping. As you may have noticed, I assume that this EPP feature or EPP requirement is associated with a projection that are quite generically called FP. There is reason to assume that, at least in Latin, this is distinct from TP. The reason for that is that finite verbs, let's say in T, are separated from material in the verb phrase, at least in head final context, by negation. That definitely has to intervene. So I'll call it FP. Doesn't ultimately really matter. In any event, when you apply this kind of operation, you end up with this typical aux final or T final syntax that you very often find in Latin. So ultimately, I will assume that this is correct, but there are there's questions that remain about the ontology of this kind of derivation. Why is there pi-piping? Can we further explain this? Now, the second, the nature of the innovative grammar that is most prevalent in late Latin is summarized in the tree in 2. There's no longer VP movement here. EPP checking is done by verb movement. So here, V moves to T. There is a complication of neg P. Whenever there is neg P, I should have been more accurate. It should have been incorporation of the intervening negation in order to avoid violation of the head movement principle. In any event, there is independent evidence for that. And in addition to that, there is also the option of applying A-movement for subjects, but logically speaking, this is unrelated to EPP satisfaction. And as I mentioned at all times, it is optional. One question that remains here is the nature of the transition from grammar A to grammar B. How do we model that? So if we then move to weak voice, the crucial observation here is the syntax morphology mismatch that has been talked about a lot, most recently in a very interesting paper by Lieven and Kalivoda, which I really recommend. I can't really do justice to it today, but it's really quite nice. So the crucial observation is that whenever there is explicit voice morphology and explicit tense morphology, the tense morphology tends to sit closer to the root than the voice morphology, and in most languages, it's really the other way around. For example, in ancient Greek, there's clear evidence for that. So you find things like laudabatur, laudabitur. Those exemplify this kind of morphology syntax mismatch. And what I would like to propose is that this is very much of the same nature as a very well-known kind of mismatch between syntax and morphology, which was talked about which was discussed at length in Chomsky 57. It's of course the fact that a tense contrast like the one in 4, for some reason I wrote 4C, that should be 4B, that this tense contrast, past tense versus a present tense, that this is expressed in the absence of V to T movement. Now, there's a lot that can be said about these data. There's comparative evidence from languages that do have V to T movement. There is the discussion about how this observation ties in with the system of English auxiliaries and so on. But in any event, it's clear that there is something going on here. The way Chomsky has interpreted this in earlier work, well, let me just, before we go there, remind you of the fact that it's really quite special, because Chomsky did have to invoke a crazy rule like affix hopping. So that's an otherwise unheard of operation of syntactic lowering in order to make sense of this pattern, and more in particular its relation with auxiliaries. Anyway, in more recent work, Chomsky has revisited the nature of English T. He has mainly talked about the weak subject-verb agreement of that head. And he has proposed that T can therefore not label its mother node, and therefore needs a DP specifier to do that, and that gives you subject movement to spec TP or expletive insertion, let's say classical EPP effects. So as I said in the introduction, I would like to depart from that slightly, although ultimately I don't want to say that this impoverished morphology is altogether unrelated to the kind of morphological weakness that I have in mind. But I would like to say that it's really the data in force that are the clincher. So it's the tense properties of English T that make English T weak in this particular sense. And in the next phase, I would like to carry this over to Latin voice. As to the background assumptions that I make about possible instantiations of voice, I will more or less wholesale adopt the proposal from Alexiadou et al. 2015, who proposed that voice can be characterized by two independent features. One governs whether or not the head introduces an agent argument. They represent it with the notation lambda x. I will more or less follow Legat here and say that it's indicative of the fact that voice has 5 features. And then there's the independent parameter which specifies whether or not DP specifier is required above voice. If you apply this, you get the following options. If both parameters are set positively, you get an argument and an obligatory specifier. That's an active transitive sentence. In 5b, you get the option with the argument without the specifier. That's a canonical passive. If you omit the argument, but stick in some sort of specifier of a particular kind, namely a reflexive, then you get a reflexive marked anticausative of the type you find in Romance and in Germanic, se and sich reflexives. That's option C. Option D has none of that at all, has no argument and has no specifier. And then you have non-active marked anticausatives. Then there is one additional variant which dispenses with voice altogether, and that's what you get in the case of unmarked anticausatives, or more generally, unaccusatives. Now let's apply this to Latin, and let's add labeling questions to the mix. If we start with an active transitive clause, you get a labeling problem at the level of voice. Recall that I'm assuming that voice can't label. So what we get here, there is a D feature, there is an obligatory specifier, and it is the 5 features of this specifier that can provide the label. There is the additional possibility here that the 5 features on voice do play a role after all. And in the next slide, I will actually suggest that that's correct. What may be the case here is that there is some sort of agreement between the 5 features in the specifier and the 5 features on voice. If we then move to personal passives, recall that those differ from actives at the level of the absence of a specifier. Again, there is a labeling problem. Voice can't provide the label. What I would like to say here is that it's again a 5b that you get. Now you may say that I'm cheating because, well, actually the 5 features come from voice. That's true, but the crucial thing here is that the nature of the label is not verbal. It's not something that is in any sense, in any relevant sense, associated with verbal voice morphology. The 5 features really are associated with an agent argument. So that's the most important thing. And as I hinted at it when I was talking about the previous slide, this may actually also play a role in the derivation of active sentences. Then the final structure, which is we need to have a look at, is the non-active marked anticausatives, which are also attested in Latin from an early period onwards. Here, voice does not have any special features at all. And here, the only option to provide a label is basically mimic what Chomsky proposed in 2015 for English T and EPP effects, you internally merge the internal argument. Note that this is not an option that you can apply to the passives we had earlier, but there was also a specifier lacking, because there it really result in a clash between the feature specifications of voice, the agent argument that is semantically there. And it would be some kind of movement into a theta position. That's not something we want. Good. Anyway, so we have three kinds of structures in which the highest node of the structure is a phi p. And if we relate that to what we said earlier about there being an F head, a probing F head that needs that has an EPP requirement and needs phi features. So in all of the cases that we've been through, the highest occurrence of phi features would indeed be at the top node of the thematic domain. And there's a number of ways. So basically that gives you VP movement, that gives you the VP movement, the spec FP that I had on my the first tree we discussed. In addition to that, it doesn't give you only gives you voice P movement, it also blocks a movement of subjects. There's some kind of minimality violation going on there. Ritzi talked about that in recent work. The idea is that it's really the highest occurrence of a given feature that the node that it's associated with that is eligible for further computation. So that was what weak voice can do and what it can block. 5-minute warning. Okay, thank you. So let's then have a look at a new kid on the block, namely these unmarked anticausatives. So the tree we looked at, the one that had internal merge of the internal argument, that would be relevant for a structure like 11a. That's a non-active marked anticausative. And here I added, well, no, Pliny added the adverb sponte, which really shows that this is an anticausative, not a passive. Rumpitur could have been rumpit. In 11b, you find a slightly different, but semantically equivalent variant of the same anticausative verb, which is not marked for non-active morphology, but which comes out as an active infinitive in this case. Could have been rumpi. Now, there is a lot of work, in particular done by Feltenius in a lexicographic study from 77. The very robust generalization is that the pattern in 11a is older, and there's every reason to assume that this is indeed the one that is inherited from Proto-Indo-European. The unmarked anticausatives in 11b, so basically the language goes through a phase of this being more and more popular. In a later stage, these are largely supplanted by anticausatives marked with a reflexive, but those are very rare in late Latin. Now, that means that we need to think about what this could mean for our story of labeling. And recall that according to Alexiadou et al., these unmarked anticausatives, they are characterized by the complete absence of voice P. So the very rudimentary structure we would have is the one in 11. So there is simply a root that takes an internal argument, and then there is a categorizing head, little v, and nothing more. So it's obvious, of course, that all the labeling work is done here by little v, and there's no way that there can be voice P movement, voice P / phi P movement to satisfy any APP requirement, because there is no voice layer to begin with. So what you get is something that looks really close to what I earlier described as the my grammar B. So there is no, the option of voice P movement is completely excluded. And then something else has to, the parameters have to be reset in another way. There's two candidates. Either it can be V to T movement that moves on further to F, or there can be DP movement, so the internal argument in this case. Now, the reason why I think the V to T movement option wins out is related to locality. There is V to T movement anyway, and which will make sure that the finite verb is in all cases the closest goal for the functional head, that the higher one that bears the EPP requirement. And I think that's more or less the gist of the story that gives you the new parameter setting. On the other hand, the new parameter setting also opens up the way, it opens up the door for a movement to be possible, but not obligatorily so. There's a number of technical questions about the implementation of this change and out the evidence that provides the necessary cues to language learners for this parameter setting to come about. Do quiz me about that if you want to know more about it. Let me just finish by saying a couple of words about the fate of weak voice. This definitely doesn't disappear overnight, but what I do think is that the developments that we talked about in the new EPP system constitute the first nail in the coffin of this phenomenon. And that there is actually in Latin from a fairly early point onwards evidence for unambiguous voice morphology that is not only unambiguous but also sits in the right place. Two such structures come to mind. They're diagrammed in 13 and 14. One is the famous or perhaps infamous case of the passive future infinitive, which is the one tiny corner of Latin verbal morphology where passives and deponents are differentiated. Well, there's a lot that can be said about this amatum iri kind of formation. It's overall quite rare. It's really only productive in Cicero. But I think there is good evidence that here you have more explicit lexicalization of the voice head. A second kind of the same effect can also, I think, be observed in the contrast between two types of periphrastic perfects, namely the type amatus sum and the type amatus fui. I've also talked about that a lot in recent years. What I haven't talked about is the internal structure of those two variants. And I think one way of interpreting the contrast here is to say that sum really only realizes or lexicalizes tense and agreement, and that fui also explicitly adds aspect to that. Whereas in the older structure, aspect was probably contributed by the participial morphology. In the newer structures, in turn, the participial morphology may be an expression of voice. And then here's my references, and here's a thank you slide.